Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to give it a minute. I see some people trying to enter the waiting room. For those of you who are here already, there is a new format. So for some reason, Zoom decided that there needs to be this extra step of security for people to be allowed in. So we're just going to give it a couple of seconds more. For those of you following with the Chumash, we're going to start in Parashat Noah. If you have a Tanakh, that's great. We're going to go to a few different places, but if you just have your Chumash, you'll be able to follow along well. And otherwise, I'll try to the best of my ability to depict what's taking place in the verses. The first thing I'd like to do is dedicate our learning today to the Refuah Shlema of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Yaakov Zvi ben Lina. If there has been a single voice, a single presence, a single viewpoint that has affected me and given me a ton of depth of understanding and learning to understand the Torah in a practical way, in a way that affects our lives. It was Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and I owe him a huge hakarat hatov, as does the entire Jewish community for all of his contributions. Also, we are learning in the Refuah Shlema of Leah Bat Yittel, and a special, beautiful announcement. We have been learning for the restored health of Susie Bibi, Shafia Shoshana Batzara, for months now. And I think it's been maybe 6 months, but she is making tremendous progress. And we are very happy and grateful and hopeful that her recovery will be full and she will return in greater strength. So with that introduction, let's get started in Parashat Noah. I do have to say something else. I entitled this class Survival and Revival. I was so sure that it was the most clever title, and I was actually proud of myself when I was asked to submit a title. And to my horror this morning, as I was checking different viewpoints on the parasha, I realized that the title is not my own. Rav Chanoch Waxman had written a beautiful article. It's on the VBM, entitled the same thing. I probably remembered it from having read it by him. I recommend this article. It's very, very enlightening. And I apologize if there was any type of plagiarism. What happens is when you like something and you read it and you incorporate it into your being, you suddenly think it's your own. I was fortunate enough to realize that it wasn't, and it came to my attention through me. So thank God for that. But that is his catchy title. And let's see if we can add some ideas to that. Okay, so let's go with an overview of this week's parasha, Parashat Noah. I'm going to just give the whole overview first, and then we'll zero in on a couple of parts. But at the very beginning of the parasha, Noah is described. He's an Ish, that's Tzaddik Tamim in his generation. We'll come back and talk about that. Therefore, God commands him to build an ark. He's only going to spare Noah. And Noah follows God's instructions to a T, and everything that God tells him, he follows. And we move on, and he builds the ark. The flood comes, the flood goes, the dove goes out, the dove comes back. We have that whole story going on. And finally, Noah disembarks from the Tava. He brings sacrifices to God. He's charged by God to be fruitful and multiply. We have the famous rainbow in this week's parasha. And then he plants a vineyard, and we have the very tragic ending where his son Ham ends up being cursed and Noah dies. There's actually, after his death, a whole list of the genealogy, then the story of the Leaning Tower of Babel, and again, a list of a genealogy which brings us all the way to Abraham. So in a way, our parasha is sort of a sandwich. It starts with Noah and it ends with Abraham. And with that being said, it's very hard to learn Noah without understanding that he is going to be a segue. It's going to be 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, but we should also know that it was 10 generations from Adam to Noah. And putting all of this together, the question that most people want answered is, how is it possible in the beginning of his life that Noah starts out at the top of the hill? He's at the top of his game. He's an Ish Tzaddik Tamim. And by the end, he is disgraced, he is depressed, he is to the point of cursing. It gets very, very tough for the end of his life. And we want to understand more or less what the trajectory of his life was. So before we start in the actual parasha, we should go to where he is first introduced to us, which was at the end of last week's parasha. It's page 26 in the Stone Edition Chumashim, and it's chapter 5, verse 29 in Parashat Bereshit. It says, Vayechi Lemech, and Lemech, they state the years of his life, and he gives birth, Vayoled Ben, he gives birth to a child, and that child, after 595 years old, his name, Vayikra et Shemo Noach, he calls him Noach, saying, Ze yenachamenu mima'asenu umi'itzvon yadenu min ha'adama asher erera Hashem. This one, this Noach, yenachamenu, the word Noach has within it some type of form of comfort. Yenachamenu, from the word Noah, he will comfort us from our deeds. We have to ask, what were the deeds? Umi'itzvon yadenu. So the deeds, if we just turn back a couple of pages, we will see that the people in verse, at the end of chapter 4, verse 26, it says, the people started as huchal likro b'shem Hashem. It became either huchal, like chol, as opposed to kodesh. Calling out in God's name was no longer a holy endeavor. We're going to see also that there have been many, well, we'll see it when we move on to this week's parasha, of the behavior of the people. But regardless, this Noach, it seems more that he's gonna yenachamenu mima'asenu, from our deeds, but also mi'itzvon yadenu, from the pain of our hands. And what does that mean? What's the pain of their hands? Min ha'adama, from the earth that God had cursed. Maybe what Lemech is referring to when he names Noach by this name is that at this point, maybe we will have literally menucha. We will get a rest, we'll catch a break. Ever since God cursed Adam, we've had to work our heads off. And so now maybe finally with the birth of this child, maybe we could catch a break and our hands could take a rest. And I ask, why would he say such a thing with the birth of Noah? What would Noah have to do with his chance to finally get a rest? So there are a couple of things. I very often say that every 7 generations, the 7th generation does kapara for that first generation. So if Adam was the first generation, then you have Cain, Enosh, Irad, Mechuyael, Metushael, and Lemech. Lemech is the 7th generation from Adam. And maybe Lemech is saying, if Adam's curse was that he has to work the land and thorns and thistles are going to grow for him, then maybe finally now, in my lifetime, says Lemech, in my 7th generation, we will finally get a chance to rest, and maybe perhaps the world will start to operate as it had before God punished Adam. And that's one way to possibly understand that. If we want to understand that the menucha or the nechama, the rest or the comfort, was from a physical activity or from a curse that God had placed upon mankind. We usually read it saying mima'asenu means that we caused, this is going to be an important part of our story, we caused this evil that is befalling upon us, and the birth of Noah is going to bring us some type of reprieve from that. If you just turn the page towards the next couple of verses, or right at the bottom, verse 5, Hashem sees that Rabara at Ha'adam, that mankind, that humanity, and I'm going to use the word for humanity as Adam, I believe it's a play on words. Yes, Adam could have been redeemed in the 7th generation, in Lemech's generation. It's possible. But because Rabara at Ha'aretz, because there was so much evil in the land, and all his thoughts is rak ra, he's just all full. I created him to be kitov, but he's rak ra. I created him to be good, but now he's evil. And then we have one more play on the word of Noah, vayinachem. The word vayinachem, the English says he either reconsiders, or he regretted, or he wanted to turn back the Adam, having created Adam. And then we see, this is, to me, I think the hardest words in all of Torah to read. I have a hard time reading them. It says, Vayit'atzev el libo. That God himself was saddened in his own heart. The Torah has to go to anthropomorphism. It has to give God a heart so that his heart could be sad. And it's the only way for the Torah to express to us how God was feeling after seeing the fruits of his labor, his creation, go from tov vera. And like a potter with his clay, Vayomer Hashem, Hashem says, and I want you to notice, it's very, very important, that the name for God at the end of Bereshit, Vayar Hashem, the Yud Ke Vav Ke, Vayomer Hashem, Be'eneh Hashem. This is Vayit Atsev Alibo, the fact that God is saddened to his heart. It's not the God of justice here. It's not the God even of soul creation. At this point, having revealed his facet, his aspect of the Yud Ke Vav Ke, of the God that allows man to be a creator, of the God that allows man to literally be in the image of Hashem himself, this is the God who's now operating and saying, Emche et ha'adam. I was willing to go as far as letting God, the man, be a creator. But now, in order to blot out man, in order to take man who was made from the earth, how would we disintegrate something that we made out of earth and water? He's going to literally melt it. He's going to take the clay and add so much water to it, so to speak, so that it will melt. And the idea and the hope that we have when we read this is that if God is melting or blotting out man, he will take some materials and reconstruct and rebuild again. And that's where we were ending off last week. And God does the play on words. Nichamti ki asitam. I regret or reconsider having made them. And the last few words are the words of hope. V'noach matzachen. Many communities say this in their Havdalah on Saturday night when Shabbat, Motza'ei Shabbat, when Shabbat is over, Noach matzachen be'enei Adonai. And these are very important words, and I think it's so poignant that we say them during our Havdalah, because Havdalah is the start of a new week. It's as if we and our souls, we have new souls, we're new people, we've been recreated, we've gone through the Shabbat experience, and now we're energized to start new. And so this idea, Noach matzachen be'enei Adonai, we're going to have to now qualify or quantify a little bit more what our parasha is talking about. So let's start at the beginning of Parashat Noah. Ele toldot Noach, Noach ish tzaddik. This is the story, or these are the offsprings. This is the toledah. This is the outcome of Noach, who was an ish tzaddik tamim haya bedorotav. So first of all, his name is written twice. Ele toldot Noach, Noach ish tzaddik. His name is written twice. He's called a ish, he's called a tzaddik, and he's called a tamim. Then we have these words bedorotav, in his generation. Many of the commentaries like to compare him. Had he lived in the time of Abraham, they say maybe he would not have been as much of a tzaddik, but for his generation, relatively speaking to the generation that he lived in, he seemed like a tzaddik. That's one of the most famous ways to translate this. I'd like to say something a little differently for today. I think it's relevant to us today. I want to say the end of the pasuk is Et ha'Elohim hithalech Noach. Remember how last week it was all about God? It was all about the Yud Kei Vav Kenim. Hashem Amad, Hashem this, Hashem Nichem, Noach Matzachem Be'enei Hashem. Now, all of a sudden, the text goes from the Yud Kei Vav Ke, whether it's the God of mercy that you want to consider, or you want to consider it that the God who had allowed man to be a partner in creation, well, guess what? By the time we get to Parashat Noah, we already see the winds of change upon us. We already see that God himself is going by the name Elohim, by the name of the God that created the world. And so already, without reading another word, we know that this is a take two of creation. Elohim is suiting up, so to speak. He's putting on his creator's hat, and with his creator's hat, he's going to move forward. He's going to drive a lot of what we're going to see in this parasha. Let's go back to Noah for a minute, because our question was, how does the Ish Tzaddik end up in despair and disgrace? Maybe the hints are right here in this first verse. Maybe Noah was an Ish Tzaddik. It's clear that he was righteous, because God says it himself. God tells him, I see that you are righteous in the generation, and therefore I'm going to spare you and have you make a capsule and preserve you so that I could start the new world. But maybe these words, Tamim Haya Bedorotav, maybe those words could possibly be meant, what is Tamim? Tamim means maybe perfect. How is one perfect? I'm recalling the verse that is used to describe Yaakov Avinu. He's an Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim. In order to be perfect, like a Setamim, like something that is that's intact, sometimes to remain intact, Tamim Haya Bedorotav, maybe he had to be separate and apart and protected from his daughter, from his people. The only way that he could stay being a tzaddik was being exclusive of his generation, being removed, being insulated, being insular, like the imagery of the Tam Yoshev Ohalim. Yaakov, for instance, we could picture him in contrast to Esav, who's a Ish Sayed, Ish Sadeh, a man who's always out there. The contrast would be that Esav was engaging with the world and out there, while Yaakov was insular and enclosed and in this protected space. And maybe the fact that he was a Tamim Bedorotav is going to inform the end of the Parashah. Maybe the fact that he did not engage with his daughter, and it's a very fine line, and I'd like to be very careful about presenting it, but there's possibly something to be said, and I'd rather the Torah say it and not me, for the next few words, Et Elohim hithalech Noach. Well, if he didn't engage with society, and granted society, as we saw one verse earlier, was immoral and corrupt, 1,000%, his path, Noach's path was Et ha-Elohim hithalech Noach, was to go and be in the company of Elohim. And Noach has 3 children. I'm going to leave the topic because we're going to come back to it. Noach has 3 children, Shem, Ham, and Yafet. And then we have this word vatishachet, shachat, shachat, over and over, the idea of destruction. The land has been, the people have been corrupted in front of God. The land is filled with Hamas. Hamas is very often translated into many different types of immorality. Vayad Elohim, he sees the land that it is nishchata, that it is destroyed, that it is corrupted, and ki hishchit kol basar et darko, because the people themselves have become corrupt on the land. And it starts to bring to mind this idea of vatimale ha'aretzotam. The land does absorb the actions of the people. The land does absorb the immorality of the people. The land has already absorbed we already have had this idea where one man, for instance, Cain commits murder, and now the blood is calling out from the ground. The ground has been absorbing not just the blood of Hevel, but it has been absorbing all of the immorality. And that's another reason why the world itself probably had to become a virtual, not even a virtual, a mikveh. The world became a mikveh. It got filled with water. We're going to see the language that's used for the deluge that's going to come upon us. Vayomer, and so Elohim tells Noach, we're operating in the modality of Elohim. He tells Noach that the land has been filled with Hamas, and it's ketz, like katzti bechayai. It's the end of all living flesh. Mashchitam, hineni mashchitam. Here's that shachat word again. I'm going to destroy them. I'm going to actually mashchitam et haaretz, and the land is going to be destroyed because of their corruption of the land. And here's the important part. Here's his command. Here's the instruction in verse 14. Make for yourself a teva, an ark. Atzeh gofer, make it out of this special type of wood, gofer wood. Kinim taaseh et hateva, and make it with certain levels or compartments. And then we have this instruction, vekafarta ota mibayit umichutz bakofer. Vekafarta. That's actually our first reference for kapara, for Yom Kippur. The covering that we always refer to on Yom Kippur comes from this vekafarta ota. And yes, This is going to be a huge Yom Kippur for the people. They're going to be judged, but at the same time, there's going to be a chance for a renewal of the people. But what's interesting is that God's methodology of building the ark is a little bit unusual. Vekafarta ota, how is it going to be covered? What is it, the tar and the pitch, and how are we going to waterproof it, so to speak? According to the verse, we're going to waterproof it from the inside first. Me buy it. First, we're going to waterproof the inside. If anybody was ever going to build a boat, you would think that they would waterproof the outside first and then waterproof the inside. Because if you waterproof the inside first, then until the outside gets done, there is going to be the wood is going to be compromised, especially since we're using wood and we know that water could easily ruin wood. I think what the text is starting to tell us is that the process of building the Teva for Noah is not just about him building a Teva, it's about him rebuilding himself, because he is going to be the prototype, the DNA for the humanity that's going to come. And in order for this new world to have its best shot at survival, vekafarta otami bayit, the kippurim, the kapara, the renovations need to start from the inside first and work their way outwards. I say this because I think it speaks to the tamim component as well. You are mibayit, you are within, you are insular, you are protecting yourself. You don't want to engage with the outside world, and the outside world is corrupt, it's clear. But in order for there to be a kapara, the kapara is going to require you coming from the bayit to the chutz. You have to be strong enough, you have to waterproof yourself, so to speak, your insides, so that you could then engage with the world in some type of a bulletproof, some type of a coating, some type of a covering. And he goes on and he explains the idea of the three measurements of the Teva. You have the length, which is 300 amot. You have the width, which is 50 amot. You have the height, which is 30 amot. I once read a very beautiful piece that said that the 30, the 300, and the 50 represent the lamed, the shin, and the nun. They put together, gematrially speaking, they come together for the word lashon. And maybe one of the hints that God was telling Noah when he was building this teva, which incidentally they say took 120 years to build, maybe don't just build these measurements, but build your lashon, build your language, build your communication skills, build the ability for you to interact verbally. We read the entire episode of Noah, and nowhere does Noah say a single word. He doesn't speak. I always say if they cast you in a play to play Noah, you don't have a speaking part. First time he speaks is when he's going to curse his son Ham. That means from the very beginning of this entire episode, he never speaks, not to God, which he's often chastised for, where Abraham was negotiating for the benefit of his, of his generation. You know, if there's 50 tzaddikim, if there's 40 tzaddikim, and God speaks, and when Abraham speaks to God, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. There's so much dialogue that takes place between Abraham and his fellow man, and between Abraham and God. We don't see any of that here. He doesn't communicate, not with God He doesn't communicate. At least none of it is recorded here. He doesn't communicate with humanity. Some midrashim say that it took him that long to build an ark because as he was building, people would say, "What are you doing?" And he would say, "I'm building an ark. You better behave because God's going to destroy the world." But none of that is here in the actual text. And so I'm going to quote Harav Hanoch Waxman. He said, when it comes to the task of following God's law, when it comes to him detail by detail fulfilling God's command, Noah gets an A+ for that. Every single thing that God asked him to do, it says over and over, Vaya'as Noach kechol asher tziva oto Elohim ken asa. Over and over, it repeats that Noah followed instructions. So on his report card, he gets an A+ for following the instructions. Unfortunately, and I'll just give you a few instructions, the way that God tells them to come into the Teva, he tells them to come in separately. He tells them to come in, the men separately, the women separately, and let me see if I can find the verse. If I can, I will. Yeah, it says here, Ubata el Teva, come into the Teva, you and your sons, Atau banecha, ishtecha uneshe banecha itach, and your wife and your daughter-in-laws with you. In other words, it's time to come into the Teva, and men with the men, it's as if there was a mechitza, and the women with the women, which starts for us to understand that during the time of the flood, that was a time for there to be a separation. But then when the flood is over, and this is where I want to start to build our story. And by the way, Chodesh Tov, it's Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan. Some people call it Mar Cheshvan. Hopefully we'll be able to drop the Mar and this will become a time for us to celebrate in the future. But just for our parasha's sake, it happens to be that in verse 11, chapter 7, in the 600th year of Noah's life, Bechodesh Hasheni, Beshiva Asad Yom LaChodesh, Nikve'u Kol Ma'ayonot Tehom. So it was on the 17th day of the second month. We could suggest that the second month is a Cheshvan. We haven't had the Nisan and we haven't had yet the redemption from Egypt. So it's possible that it's on the 17th day of this month that the waters opened up and the literally the bottom waters came to the top waters came to the bottom, and we have 40 days and 40 nights of rain. Regardless, finally the rain stops and the land, the ark is able to land on Har Ararat. So I want to take a minute and go back to verse 11 or verse, I apologize, let's do this. Let's go quickly to verse 7 in chapter 7. Vayiftach Noach et hachalon. Noach opens up the window of the teva that he had built, and he sends out an orev. He sends out a raven, and the raven does nothing. He just vayetze yatso vashov ad boshet hamayim el hamayim. It doesn't seem that he had any particular mission to fulfill. It seems that he may even have come back. He doesn't have a direction. But in verse 8, he sends out the Yonah. And when he sends out the Yonah, he sends him out with a specific mission, lirot, to see whether or not the waters have dried up from the face of the land. But the first time he sends the Yonah does not find a place to rest its little kaf ragla, her feet. And she comes right back because the whole land was still filled with water. And Noah sends out his hand and he brings her back in. And now he waits 7 more days. He sends out the Yonah again, and this time she comes out And it's le'et erev. We should notice that in verse 11, they're telling us the time of day that the dove came back. In other words, if it's le'et erev, she wasn't looking to come back empty-handed. She was going to try to the best of her ability to fulfill her mission and bring some kind of sign so that she could report back to Noah. And by the evening time, she finally was able to bring back an olive branch that she had torn with her mouth. And now Noah understood that the waters are starting to recede. And finally, 7 days later, we say he sends out the Yonah. And these important words, Velo yasva shuv elav. And the Yonah does not return anymore. But it says elav. She doesn't return to him anymore. And I only brought you to the story of the Yonah because I think it juxtaposes beautifully Yonah's mentality with the dove's mentality. The dove, which is a symbol of hope. It's it's our symbol of hope. We have it on a lot of our state of Israel. It's very prominently represented. We have the dove with the olive branch even. The symbol of hope that the dove displays is that the past and the traumas that we survived, they exist, they're real. I have an olive branch to show for it, that this is the devastate, as real as this devastation was, equally real is going to be the survival and the rebuilding. And the dove demonstrates, I don't know what the future holds for me. She's going out into a world that only has tops of trees at best showing, but whatever is out there in my future, I feel the dove is saying, is better than staying stuck in my past. And I say stuck in the past because Noah is still in his ark. By the time we get to verse 14, in the second month, on the 27th day, the land itself was fully dry. And God has to speak to Noah. Vayidaber Elohim el Noach. He has to tell him, Tzeh min ha-teva. It's time for you to get out of the teva. It's time for you to let go of the past. It's time for you, and this is where my thought process was with the survival business, you need to change gears. You're no longer in survival mode. Now it's time for you to be in revival mode, even in thrival mode, so to speak. And so when the dove exhibits for us this willingness to go out there into the unknown, to start a new world and leave the past behind her, Noah needs to be told, and incidentally, this is the first time that the Torah has the word vayidaber. God never dabered before. He never spoke. This is where we say dibur is dialogue. Up until now, everything that Hashem uttered was under the auspices of the word vayomer. God is now creating a new format for communication. And maybe I'd like to suggest that he's doing so because in the format of vayomer, which was a monologue, which was just God speaking, which was God speaking and creating as he was speaking, Amirah, as he speaks, Vayomer Hashem, that's how everything was created in the world. Dibur has a different connotation to it. Dibur is trying to engage the listener and elicit a response. And what he's telling Noah is, Noah, I am going to have a dialogue with you, a back and forth, because I want you to be able to start to develop this skill of interacting with humanity. So I'm going to try it out on you first. And what God says in his dibur is, Se min hateva, Many commentaries say that the word teva actually means like Rashi Tevot. A teva is a word. So tzeh min hateva, come out, come mibayit to the chutz. It's time for you to go from the innards, from the enclave, from the protected area. It's time for you to come out. And he gives him the specific order. You with your wife, whereas before you went in separately, now I want you to come out in pairs. You with your wife and your sons with their daughters. And then he tells him this very beautiful line, Uparu viravu al haaretz. I want for there to be this proliferation taking place on the earth. We know the Bereshit, the first version of God's creation, was God charging Adam, Peru urvu. So we're getting the sense here that now God is asking for a recreation of the world. But what happens? Verse 18, Vayetze Noach ubanav. He doesn't come out together with his wife. He's not prepared for the revival part of his mission. He is only still focused on the survival mode. He comes out with his sons. That's the way he went into the ark. The same Noach that went into the ark together with his sons, and the girls with the girls and the boys with the boys, that's how he comes out of the ark. And that for us is going to be a very telling a very telling act on his part. It also doesn't say, we should notice, whereas before everything that Noach did, it said as God had commanded. Noach did exactly as God had commanded. And here it doesn't say that Noach did exactly as God had commanded. And as for the Peru urvu, be fruitful and multiply, unfortunately, Noach does not father any more children after this. And I'd like to say that what Noach is undergoing at this point, because we have to ask ourselves, what happened to the Noach, not only that was a tzaddik, but what happened to the Noach who was following God's orders word for word? And it's possible that, and again, whenever we read Torah, it's, I believe, to relate to us today. I think it's possible, reading it now this year with events being as they are, I think Noach is experiencing a chronic stress. This emotion that he has, it's not a trauma, a hurricane or a bear attacking him or something that comes on suddenly. This is something that's taking its toll. It's having an effect. It's having a wear and tear, so to speak, on the psyche of Noach. Up until now, Noach has been operating with all intellect. Everything that God told him, he was only using his mind, but he wasn't using his heart. There was no emotion in what he was doing. First of all, not only were there no elicited responses, but how do you live through a situation where the entire generation on your watch, so to speak, was totally destroyed? How does one even, the emotional part of Noach had to be shut down completely. And yes, in a trauma, in a fight or flight situation, very often we have a split second. There's no time to sit and think and come up with a plan. It's fight or flight. But this was years in the making. This was a more premeditated, it was a more planned, there was a forecast that was foreseen. He had total awareness. The whole episode was very mindful for Noah. And the 120 years, I think, of mindfulness, of being aware and of anticipating it, I think it took its toll on Noah. And he went into survival mode for so long. And what happens in survival mode? In survival mode, people focus on their existence. It's a tunnel vision. They only have the ability to think about myself. How am I going to make it through this? How am I going to survive? Am I going to have enough toilet paper? Am I going to have enough paper towels? Am I going to have enough food? How's my family going to manage? Are my kids going to go to school tomorrow? It's hard for us in a time of survival mode to have this broader vision, to have this horizontal orientation where I could worry about everybody else. In survival mode, it's all about getting to the next minute and literally staying alive in existence. And what happens is when we go into this type of a situation, it doesn't just take a toll on our mind, it takes a toll on our body. And look, we're going through a pandemic. We thought it was over. It isn't over. Nobody knows what tomorrow's going to bring. There's a lot of uncertainty taking place. And part of this uncertainty is having an effect. We could, God forbid, become self-centered people. We could, God forbid, have the physical toll that it takes. We could experience fatigue. We could experience anxiety. It's in the case of Noah, let's keep it to Noah. He doesn't want to come out into the world. He's withdrawing. He's staying in his ohel. He is not engaging with the world. He's not piru'urvuing. If he plants anything, it's a vineyard. He's not planting wheat, which is going to grow across the expanses. We're not seeing this horizontal expansion, so to speak, for Noah. And he becomes the Ish Tam. He becomes the Tam. He fulfills his Ish Tamim. And this Ish Tamim, as opposed to Abraham, who we're going to meet soon, or even Yaakov later on, doesn't want to leave his ohel. And this low energy, minimal movement, all of that is Noah. It also could become us if we fall into this place of chronic survival mode where we're in constant state of survival mode. So I called my daughter-in-law because she's a psychologist and I figured she would help me. I said, if somebody came to you and they were feeling these emotions, this stress of what we've been going through, what is the advice that you would give a patient? And she said there are three things that are being suggested. The first one is physical movement. Literally, she used the term, the body keeps the score. When we're stressed, when we're anxious, it takes its toll on our organs. And in order to combat that, we should keep on the move. We should exercise, do yoga, be mindful, keep our bodies healthy. And I would say, as far as Noah is concerned, he is pretty active in the beginning. He's building a teva. That was not an easy thing for him to get the wood, and they didn't have all the technology that we have today. They did have great breakthroughs in technology, and possibly that's why Lamech said Noah is going to save us from having to do all of this agricultural labor, because they had discovered how to sharpen tools and things like that. But as far as physical movement, let's give that to Noah. He was moving, he was active. She said there's also a very important phrase. We had heard it before, the PTG, post-trauma gratitude, this idea of after the trauma is over, to have a sense of gratitude and recognize how fortunate we are, not focus on what we've lost, but focus on the fact that we're still standing and humanity is still standing. And Noah does that also. He brings sacrifices to God, and I would say that that's his post-traumatic showing his gratitude. I like the acronym PTG, please thank God. When all this is over, let's all remember to thank God for having spared us. She said the third is a very important component. And the third one, which right now we're having the hardest time with, but it's vital, and it was vital, I believe, for Noah also, are maintaining social connections. When people are in survival mode, they stay in their own lane. And it's very important to broaden our scope and to maintain these social connections, which we're going to talk about now in terms of Noah. So when it comes to the immorality of the world, Noah remained pure, yes, but he paid a price. His dod was corrupt, and Noah stayed tamim. But the price of his tamim was that he didn't engage, because the fear, this is my own thought, is he was afraid that if he would engage with the world, that they would contaminate him as well. And I also think that that's why God tells Noah to build from the inside out. If you're strong on the inside, then you can go to the outside. But if you're not strong on the inside, then you can't subject yourself to the influences of the outside world. So I was looking around to see are there any other tzaddik tamims in Tanakh that maybe we can learn from? And sure enough, there's one other tzaddik tamim, and that is Iyov, the book of Job, Iyov himself. And at one point in chapter 12, he complains and he says, I am the one who is mocked by my friends. I am the one who calls on God. God answers me, but the just and the blameless are ridiculed. It's possible that the tzaddik and the tamim, who Iyov says are made a tzechok of, are ridiculed. It's possible that Iyov is informing us and possibly even defending Noah by saying that it's not easy to be a tzaddik amongst people who are non-believers, because the tzaddik amongst the non-believers are going to be mocked and they're going to be ridiculed, and it's not easy. And maybe he's explaining Noah's social isolation to us. But at the end of the day, we can't forget that what happens is the story ends with the birth of Abraham. God's going to give us another modality. He's going to, actually, I'm going to take 1 minute because I see I have the time. Rav Hanoch Waxman says he compares Noah with Lot. I think it's a beautiful comparison, because he says both Noah and Lot survive the destruction of an evil society. Noah is during the time of Hamas, and Lot is during the time of Sodom. And both of them are in both cases, only one family is going to survive. And they make it out in one piece, and they both make it out just in the nick of time. The floods are already gathering, and Lot, had he stayed another minute, I don't know if he would have made it out alive. And after they both leave, they each go into an enclosed space. Noah goes into the ohel, and Lot goes into the cave, and they both drink wine. Noah plants his vineyard. Lot is given wine by his daughters. And ultimately, both of them are in a vulnerable state with their children after having been plied, or even after having had the wine. In the case of Noah, we're not sure exactly, it's a story for another day, what happened with Ham, whether he, according to some commentaries, castrated him, or whether Ham slept with Noah's wife, which was his mother. And there's a lot in the text to prove many of those things, whether it was just the sight of him uncovered. I'm not going to get into that today, but he was in a vulnerable situation and sort of taken advantage of by his child. And in the case of Lot, he was under the influence, and his daughters became pregnant from him. But what I'd like to say is this: whereas Noah ends his life being disgraced and disgusted and cursing his son, Lot, as crazy as this is going to sound, he ends up reviving and building the next nation. He ends up with Ammon and Moab. These are nations, and we should take note that these are nations that have inalienable rights to their land. They're not like the Canaanim that when we come into Eretz Yisrael, we're going to chase them out and take the land. Ammon and Moab are their own established nations. So whereas Noah who's born from Noah after the flood? Canaan. Who's born from Lot after his destruction? Ammon and Moab. Literally, the names of the children, he's literally rebuilding himself as well. Moab, Me'av, this child is from Lot. Ammon, Ben Ami, a child of my nation. And we could ask this question, and what is it that allows for Lot to rebuild and not Noah? And the one thing, and it's a little bit of a scary and a slippery slope, so I'm going to try and say it to the most correct way that I can. We meet Lot and we're not sure what to do with him. On the one hand, he's Mr. Social Butterfly. He's inviting angels to his house. On the other hand, he's sitting at the gates of the city. Maybe he's the governor, the mayor, the judge of the city. He's a very social being, and he interacts with everybody that comes his way. Yes, he interacts with the evil society, but he's also inviting and protecting his guests. We're not sure what to do with Lot. He's a very complex and confusing character. He's imprudent. He's irresponsible in the way that his value system is so flawed that he offers his daughters to the immoral sodomites. And we don't know what to do with Lot. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Is he confused? We're not sure what to do. But one thing that we see is that God intervenes for him. And I'd like to suggest it's possibly because he engages with the world around him, and because he engages with others. You know, this idea of just being insular to the self could be very, very detrimental. It was in the case of Noah, but also being out there and engaging with immorality could also be very problematic. So I'd like to end with this idea because the parasha gives it to us, and it's one of my favorite icons of all of Tanakh. I love the rainbow. I love its message, its messages. We've said many different things about the rainbow in the past. We've said how it combines different types of people, different types of ideologies, different types of nations. It's a sort of a peace on earth type of a icon. But I'd like to speak today to the shape, to the way that the rainbow has both axes. it has its 2 feet on the ground, one end of the rainbow and the other end of the rainbow. It's like the feet of the rainbow are on the ground. It is horizontally inclusive. It engages with all of the colors. It depends on all of the colors to be part of the conversation, to be part of the dialogue, to be part to make it whole. We need every single color. But at the same time that it has, it's sort of horizontal. It's has its 2 feet on 2 horizontal axes. I don't even know if that's a word, axes. The top of the rainbow is actually oriented to the heavens. And so whereas Noah was only oriented vertically, he only communicated with God, if at all, because he doesn't really speak to God. And this is one of the issues that we have. The only time he speaks is to curse his son Ham. So et ha-Elohim hithalech Noach. Noach only traveled with God in his lane. And that wasn't even a dynamic relationship to the point where there was a communication. And so I think that the idea that this week's parasha has is that, yes, I think with Lot we could say that Hashem intervenes, even if we interact with society. But I think Noah teaches us and God tells us, if we're going to interact, if we're going to step outside our bubble, if we're going to step outside our ohel, and we want to maintain a measure of being tamim, then vekaparta, we have to code ourselves, and we have to make sure that we protect our value system. But protecting our value system and never going out also has its challenges. I think the parasha, and I'll end with this, I think it ends with the birth of Avraham, because it's the Torah's way of teaching us that, and by the way, by the end, we come back to the name of the Yud Ke Vav Ke. It was Elohim who brought the flood, but it's Yud Ke Vav Ke who is now going to bring the next generation into being. And for us today, for the situations that we're in, for the protocols that are in place, we still need to be careful. We still have to protect ourselves. We still have to protect society. And in order for us to come out of there, in order for us to not just survive, but revive and thrive and rebuild, I think it's important for us to remember that the brain itself has an elasticity, not just for the children that they can learn new things easily, but that we too have an elasticity, a generational elasticity. We can go from Noah, who seemed like he had no stretch left in him, but generationally speaking, we're going to find our way to Avraham. And there's always going to be that next dove, that next hope, that next icon that's going to demonstrate for us, we're going to get through this. We're going to leave the past behind us. We're going to move forward. There's going to be uncertainty, and we don't know what that's going to look like. But the Torah is telling us clearly, as we read the end of the parasha, which is very beautiful, that Terach gives birth to Noah, and he gives birth to Lot, and there's going to be a whole new world. There's going to be movement. They're going to come to Haran. They're going to keep on this trail of repopulating our world, building it on a horizontal way, but at the same time, we're going to see next week, God willing, with Abraham. Abraham is going to be the epitome of talk, communication, engagement with above, and talk and communication and engagement with society. And I hope and pray as a society that we could be a light, we could behave in a way that all of the nations want to emulate our behavior, and we need to start practicing safety And everybody, I love you. I want to thank you because you're my way of being able to connect and maintain social connections and not feel socially isolated, so that together we could all stay healthy and rebuild a beautiful future. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Yasha Koach. You're amazing. This was amazing. And all of our prayers should bring an end to this pandemic. And you should be blessed and your family be blessed.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you. Amazing classes.
Thank you.
Wow, who would think of connecting the parasha to our time now?
Thank you.
Wow.
Oh wait, I'm so sorry. I wanted to put my number here in case anybody wanted an audio of the class, because
Yes.
somebody asked, but
Yes.
I put it
Thank
in
you,
private.
Vivian, for inspiring us today. Love you.
One day and always. Fantastic class. Thank you.
So great to see everybody also. It's
Okay.
really,
Okay, so if anybody wants a recording, an audio of the class, let me shut the audio of my phone. You can feel free to text me at this number. We're working on having